Morning, friends around the world. It's another message of encouragement in lockdown here from Nigel. I'm at my desk today. It's a baking hot day. We've been doing some work around the house, but I've just been doing my daily devotional reading, and I'm reading through Judges at the moment, the book of Judges. Came across this morning that familiar story of Samson, and I was just struck by it, and I thought I'd share that with you as this message of encouragement. I'm sure you know the story of Samson. And right at the end of his complicated story, we read these words. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "O sovereign Lord, remember me. Please strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." You know, Samson led a powerful life as a judge in Israel. He was blessed by the Lord, but often exhibited pride, self-interest, greed, lust. He had a weakness when it came to the opposite sex, and his anger often got the better of him. And before we get too judgmental about Samson, you know, there's probably character flaws that you and I display as well before God. And but for his grace and mercy, we would be convicted of those character flaws just as much as Samson was. But despite Samson's character deficiencies, the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and his anger was often channeled for godly purposes. We often think of Samson as a leader with a fatal flaw that led to his untimely death. Until his downfall at the scheming hands of Delilah, Samson never really sees who the Lord is and doesn't see the world around him, definitely, through God's eyes. It takes the desperate situation of being physically blinded for Samson to actually spiritually see. And it's only then that he uses the words sovereign Lord. For the first time, he begins to put God in charge of his life. If he'd done that from the beginning, things might have been very, very different. And I don't know about you, I can associate with that some of the greatest mistakes I've made in my life are when I haven't put God in charge and haven't realised that he's sovereign. Samson certainly used his God-given abilities, his bravery, his strength, but too often he used them for his own gain rather than the Lord's. And even his greatest and most selfless victory, really there was an element of revenge in it. He only learnt his great leadership lesson in his very last prayer with his dying breath. Samson had great problems in accepting the lordship of the God Almighty. Too often he relied on his own judgment, his own actions, rather than being subject to the authority of God. And in his final act on the earth, Samson killed more Philistines in his death than he did in his life. With his desperate prayer to God, he turned disgrace and defeat, humiliation and suffering into triumph. When Samson's hair had been cut off, the Bible tells us not only did his strength desert him, but that the Lord had left him also. Can you imagine a life where the Lord has left you? Wow, that's desperate, isn't it? With his final cries, Samson was reunited with a living God who does indeed remember him. It's an irony, actually, because Samson often lived his life as if he'd forgotten God. It wasn't the other way round. It's never too late to cry out to God for strength, but it doesn't have to follow failure. It doesn't have to be a last resort. Leaders like you and like me need to recognise that God is almighty and sovereign, and we need to see the situation that we're living in through his eyes. Sovereign Lord, please strengthen me should be one of our first prayers, not our last. I'm praying right now that the sovereign Lord will strengthen you in your nations, in your families, in your churches, in your ministry, in your circumstances. Bless you. Speak to you next week. Sovereign Lord, please strengthen us. Amen.